Part 1. The little machine that wouldn't quit. They laughed the first time they saw it, not with cruelty, but with certainty, the confidence of men who believed the rules of machines were already written. German officers in sun-bleached uniforms stood on a rise above the North African port and watched the Americans unload their hardware. Fuel drums, pallets of ammunition, rows of trucks, and then a string of small, blunt-nosed vehicles that bounced down the ramps like tin insects. The desert heat made the air quiver around them. The engines were high and busy, not deep and menacing like the tigers the Germans loved, dust hung in sheets. The little cars didn't seem bothered by any of it. They were jeeps, no armor, no weight, no intimidation. A flat hood, a square windshield that folded like a book, a canvas roof if you were lucky. 4 small tires that looked better suited for farm roads than battlefields. Sober men who had crossed Europe behind half-tracks and panzers didn't need a briefing to be unimpressed. The desert, they believed, respected only mass and precision. It punished everything else. Yet the oddest thing about those first lines of jeeps wasn't how they looked. It was how many there were, how they seemed to have no end. The ships kept coughing them out until the pier itself looked like a conveyor. War doesn't negotiate with theory, only with what still runs after a day of heat and a night of sandstorms. The desert judged quickly. Bearings screamed, filters choked. Steel expanded and lost its temper. A vehicle that met every specification on paper turned shy under the real sky. It stumbled, it stalled, it asked permission. The Jeep, by contrast, didn't ask anything. It buzzed, it rattled, it leaked, but it moved. If it sank to the hubs, 4 men could lift it free. If the belt squealed, a pocket knife and a little patience set it right. If the radiator coughed, a dented can, a strip of tin, and wire became salvation. The recipe repeated itself at 1,000 road cuts and waterless wadis. Not elegance, not theory, not the clean geometry of a drafting room, just stubborn motion. What the German field diary later called light enemy vehicles acting independently was, from the American side, something less dramatic and more reliable. A habit. The habit of answering distance with speed, delay with detours, loss with more effort. The Jeep turned that habit into a system. It carried the map, then it became the map, cutting paths where no one expected a road. It hauled shells, then blood, then the letter that kept a terrified 19-year-old from going dark inside his own helmet. It brought engineers to gaps so quickly that bridges were sketches in the air long before steel touched water. It brought officers with scribbled coordinates to radios and radios to the sky, and then the system woke up, from ground to cloud and back again. Factories were the other engine in the story. The Jeep's character wasn't born on the sand, but on concrete floors where heat came from furnaces and electricity, not from the sun. Toledo, Detroit, Dearborn, names that sounded like work. Willys frames on one line, Ford frames on another, subcontractors feeding the beast with axles and pedals and lengths of cable. A line learned the shape of a thing, and then could not forget it. The repetition hardened into muscle. Every 80 seconds another Jeep fell into the world exactly like its brother. It had a serial number, but the numbers didn't mean much. What mattered was the rhythm, the drumbeat that reached backward across oceans into the hands of men who needed parts they didn't know they needed yet. German officers understood numbers. They had lived through logistics as well as battle. You could watch a single machine and admire it, or you could recognize a river. The Jeep was a river. A tiger was a masterpiece, a cathedral of steel, the work of brilliant minds in a narrow hall of time. But a masterpiece is a hostage to time and to rarity. It must be preserved against weather, men's mistakes, and ordinary bad luck. A river doesn't worry, it just keeps arriving. In the weeks before Kasserine, the desert held its breath. Then everything broke. Columns collided in anger and fear, and the sand went white with heat and black with burning rubber. What does a small machine do when the air is knives and the ground has turned to glue? It chooses the short line between 2 points. The little engine screamed up gullies, bounced across trackless slopes, darted behind bays of rock, found skirting routes for big vehicles that could not risk the same gamble. When the heavy stuff was pinned, it wasn't heavy stuff that saved it. It was motion that didn't require permission. 1,000 tiny deliveries added up to one large rescue. After the fight, the inventory of survival looked boring. Spark plugs, belts, water, morphine, maps, a sergeant with clear eyes. Boring things win wars. The Jeep existed to make boring things arrive on time. Somewhere a mechanic's hands were black, somewhere a medic's kit went light, somewhere a radio cooled after hot hours, somewhere a 19-year-old looked up because a sound he'd already learned to love was coming toward him again. A busy, breathless engine. Closer, closer, now. All the while, the record-keeping part of war drew lines under columns. How many shipped? How many received? How many failed and for what reasons? Men who wrote these ledgers wore ties under coveralls and had families that waited at 5 o'clock. They were not heroes in the script sense, but they were lending every mile of road a dependable nerve. The Germans had mathematicians who could compute perfect engagements. The Americans had accountants who could guarantee the next delivery. Between a perfect engagement and a guaranteed delivery, the desert tended to take the delivery. No one who has worked a machine for any length of time doubts that machines have personalities, if not souls. The Jeep's personality was accessible. It did not condescend. A tiger told you what it needed. A Jeep asked what you needed. You could approach it without superstition. It tolerated amateur repair and forgave clumsy hands. It liked to be driven with a kind of cheerful disrespect, the way you might push a friend's shoulder to get him moving. Its springs talked to you. Its steering told the truth about the ground. Any vehicle can teach you fear. A few teach you trust. The Jeep taught familiarity. Men slept leaning against its fenders with their boots still on. They ate with their feet on the running board. They learned to throw an arm over the windshield frame without thinking. If you had to leave fast, you could. If you had to stay, it stayed. By late spring, what had sounded like condescension began to sound like concern. The German notes grew more precise and less amused. Light enemy vehicles are used as scouts, medevac, liaison, artillery spotters. They appear where roads are absent, cross wadis with improvised methods, and return faster than interceptors can be directed. The bullet points gave away something the formal tone tried to hide: surprise and the faintest flavor of respect. When your opponent breaks a rule you believed fundamental. Roads are required, bridges are required, weight is required. Then one of your own pillars becomes thinner. Simplicity wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was an operational doctrine disguised as a mechanical decision. If a thing can be fixed by a man who had learned his trade in a garage rather than a military academy, that thing will be fixed sooner and in more places. If an engine forgives a little grit, a lot of dust, a hand that is tired and not precise, then that engine will run on days when prideful engines falter. The Jeep was honest about what it was not. It wasn't a gun. It wasn't a wall. It was a courier that believed its job was sacred and behaved accordingly. The end of the North African fighting was a lesson written in engine notes. Convoys of the little machines ran north, carrying what a defeated army leaves behind: prisoners, paperwork, small sorrows, and a few big ones. Priests bounced in the back next to bandages. Translators rode with notebooks, making sense where they could. Dust covered everything in the same color. Rank meant less at 15 miles per hour across broken flats. You were as strong as the last vehicle that still turned over when you reached for the starter. If it was a Jeep, you probably had one more road in you. What the desert had tested, Europe would challenge in another way. Africa broke machines with heat and emptiness. Europe would use thickness and wetness, hedgerows and mud and the weight of rivers. A dry gulch was one thing, a swollen French stream another. Weight that protected you from bullets often betrayed you to the earth itself. The very qualities that made a big tank, a fortress, made it an anchor. The Jeep had no illusions. It would not turn bullets. It would not shrug off shrapnel. But when the land asked a different question, can you cross, not later, not after the bridge is a plan, but now, the small machine had an equally small but decisive answer. Try. Men don't love symbols until after the work is done, but the foundation of love is laid while the work is being done. A soldier who rode 100 miserable miles in the back of a Jeep with his knees up under his chin, rain blowing sideways, the taste of canvas in his mouth, will still tell you later that the machine meant safety to him. The reason is simple. It arrived. One day the road dissolved under a steady rain, and everything heavier scuffed in place like a boot that can't find purchase. The little vehicle found purchase. The day after, the cold took tools temper, and clumsy gloves made fingers blind. The little vehicle tolerated the clumsiness. You don't need ceremony to feel grateful for that. The gratitude comes uninvited when you hear the engine and know your turn to be forgotten has been postponed again. If there is such a thing as national character translated into an object, the Jeep was an argument in that direction. It was not handsome in the classical European sense. It didn't ask to be adored. It asked to be used. It liked a little roughness. It admired effort more than style. And it was optimistic without being silly. It assumed by default that forward was available. Perhaps that is why men named them the way they named dogs and fishing boats. The name wasn't to coax performance, it was to confess affection. A man who confesses affection to a machine believes, at some stubborn level, that cooperation is possible between muscle and metal, that both can agree to continue. When the last convoys rolled to the ships and the cranes swung loads aboard for the next phase of the war, the decks filled again with the same shapes: square hoods, folded glass, canvas seats faded to a tired green. In photographs from that season, the machines look like punctuation marks crammed into the margin of a page that has run out of room. The sentences will continue on a new page: hedgerows, villages with ceilings fallen in, orchards churned into clay, weather that sobers men who had thought themselves beyond weather. The little machines would go to those pages too. Between the theatre of weapons and the economy of motion, the Jeep belonged to the latter. It could be ignored in victory parades where glory believes it deserves taller things. But the practical eye remembers what carried the orders that aligned the artillery, that broke the wall, that allowed the division to lean forward before the iron could object. In the chain, the smallest link is the one you touch most often, and its strength is proved by its absence from your worries. Ask a man what he feared in those months, and he will say shells, hunger, cold, and the midnight quiet that makes your own thoughts too loud. Ask him what he didn't fear, and he will say quietly, the start. The start, most mornings, was certain. You turned the key or the switch, you pulled the choke, you nudged the throttle, and the Jeep answered. So the laughter faded, as all confident laughter fades when repetition tells a different joke. The new sound was more complicated than respect. It was the silence of men recalculating. A machine that changes your opponent's math is more dangerous than a machine that changes his emotions. In the notes written by tidy men with sharp pencils, you can hear the erasers working. Requirements shifted. Interdiction points multiplied. Likely avenues became unlikely. Bridges lost their monopolies. The thing is small, the pencil says, but its consequence is not. The ships turned their bows toward a colder shoreline. Behind them, Africa shrank. Ahead of them, a grey sea and a green continent. The little machines were lashed down against the roll. Salt air went looking for bare metal and began its patient, corrosive work. The canvas took the white of salt crystals and would never be clean again. Men walked the decks at night to think about time. They were going the other direction now, not toward a test, but toward a verdict. If the desert had taught anything, it was that you are allowed to survive if you can keep moving. France would ask if you could keep moving through water. The river is another kind of enemy. Part gravity, part temperature, part indifference. It doesn't hate you. That is its power. Fire can be bullied, stone outmaneuvered, men outweighted. Water ignores you. Later there would be manuals and kits and sealed intakes and the confidence that comes from having done a stupid thing once and gotten away with it. But before all of that there was only a set of hands, a tube of grease, a strip of canvas, and the sentence every practical man says to himself before attempting something that might make him look like a fool. It might work. The men had never expected to love a machine this small. Some never admitted they did. But on the morning when France came up from the sea, when the wind made needles of rain and the shore sorted itself into smoke and hedges and sounds that meant hurry, the little machines were first to catch. The larger vehicles thought about it for a second, and the second was too long. The jeeps didn't think. They landed, they coughed, they shook like dogs coming out of a pond, and they went about their errand. By the end of that day, the first lessons of Europe were already stapled to the day's orders. The ground holds water like a grudge. The roads have grown tired of carrying heavy things. Stone walls are older than any plan. From the second day to the last one, the question was never abstract. It was, will the next necessary thing arrive soon enough? The jeep's answer was generally yes, and when it was no, it tried again with a different route, a different driver, a different faith. That is the only reliable heroism in logistics. Cheerful stubbornness disguised as a schedule. This is how a small vehicle earns a large reputation, not through a single miracle, but through thousands of refusals to let distance become defeat. In North Africa it had refused heat. In France it would refuse water. The German officers who had smiled at the first sight of it would, by and by, stand on another rise in another country and watch something that was not supposed to happen anyway. They would not laugh, they would not speak. They would watch a small shape wobble where a bridge used to be and make the far bank look closer than it had a minute before. And somewhere on that bank, a 19-year-old would hear the engine and feel his chest loosen by a half-inch, because if the little machine could cross, maybe everything else could too. Part 2. Across France. The ships reached England first, then waited for weather and orders. On the decks, the jeeps sat lashed under tarpaulins, their engines sealed with grease against the sea. Salt crusted every hinge, canvas stiffened like bark. The men walked among them as if among animals half asleep. They would need these small beasts soon, more than ever. When the invasion began, it was not the tanks that touched France first, but the jeeps. They came down ramps that still shuddered from shell fire, rolled through surf that hissed like static, and found the firmness of sand beneath wheels meant for everything but a beach. They did not pause to celebrate arrival. They only shook off water and began to work. By noon, the shoreline looked like a scrapyard that could breathe. Jeeps darted between craters, towing sleds of ammunition, dragging wire for communication lines, hauling medics who had run out of stretchers. Every sound competed with the sea, the pop of rifles, the scream of gulls, the rhythmic cough of the little engines that somehow never drowned. The first days in Normandy turned roads into suggestions. Fields became tracks. The hedgerows, older than the memory of nations, rose like green fortresses. Heavy vehicles choked on the narrow lanes. The jeeps, built for everything except patience, squeezed through gaps that looked too small, reversed with inches to spare, found detours that weren't on any map. They carried the commanders who had to see for themselves, the engineers who guessed where mines might sleep, the chaplains who refused to stay behind. They carried mail, morphine, and courage in equal measure. And when night came, they carried silence too, the kind that happens only when everyone in the convoy is listening for the same thing, whether the next corner is safe enough to keep breathing. The weather turned. The rain thickened into habit. Mud swallowed boots and horses both. But the jeeps rode on their small tires as if mud was simply another country that needed visiting. They spun, slid, cursed, and climbed again. A soldier wrote in his notebook that the only thing moving faster than the rain was the jeep. It was not poetry. It was logistics set to rhythm. The French countryside watched its own liberation from behind shattered windows. The locals learned quickly that the sound of freedom was not the deep roar of armor, but the busy chatter of those small engines. Wherever they appeared, bread and news followed. A child could spot one from half a mile and run to the road because a jeep usually meant chocolate or laughter or someone who spoke with their hands even when words failed. For the Germans, the laughter had ended months before. Reports now spoke of light American vehicles exploiting destroyed bridges. They appeared where bridges had been blown, crossing fords that scouts swore were impassable. The Wehrmacht believed in the geometry of infrastructure. The Americans believed in momentum. One of those beliefs survived longer than the other. In late summer, General Patton's Third Army began its dash across France. His armor could move only as fast as fuel could reach it, and the fuel rode in cans stacked like bricks on the backs of jeeps. The Red Ball Express, black drivers, white drivers, men from every corner of the states ran day and night, headlights painted blue to hide from aircraft. When the roads clogged, they made new ones through fields and ditches. The convoys became rivers of noise. In every photograph of that great supply line, there is, somewhere, a jeep, usually at the head, sometimes buried in the stream, always moving. Mechanics along the route kept barrels of oil warm over fires and changed engines in ditches by lantern light. If a truck broke, a jeep hauled its driver and its cargo forward, 2 trips if needed. Every spare part that reached Patton's tanks had once bounced in the back of a jeep. By September, the Allied line stretched so far that maps needed folding twice. Europe looked endless again, and every mile wanted a bridge. The Germans had learned to destroy them beautifully. Steel twisted down into rivers like the skeletons of fallen giants. Where the panzers saw obstacles, the jeeps saw invitations. Soldiers waded into water up to their waists, guiding the little machines across with ropes and prayers. They wrapped exhausts in canvas, sealed distributors with wax, stuffed intakes with grease. A jeep would cough, stall, shudder, and then, unbelievably, keep moving. Sometimes they floated a few yards before catching the far bank, half swimming, half crawling. Men laughed, the first real laughter in months. Not mockery this time, but disbelief that something built so plainly could defy nature itself. Patton watched one crossing from the ridge above the Moselle. The river was running high, the sky still iron with rain. Below, his engineers had failed to anchor a pontoon. The current tore it loose. A single jeep, loaded with fuel, slid into the gap and kept going. It bobbed once, twice, and climbed the opposite shore like a dog shaking itself free of water. The general turned to his aide and muttered, "Find out whose damn jeep that was." Nobody ever found out. There were too many. Autumn carried more rivers, more mud, more improvisation. Each crossing improved on the last. Crews built floating cages of empty barrels. Others lashed wooden doors from ruined barns to the sides for buoyancy. Every idea that sounded stupid enough to try was tried. Some sank. Most didn't. The Germans began to record enemy amphibious capacity in their reports, a phrase that still carried disbelief inside it. Across the plains of Lorraine and into Belgium, the small convoys grew into habits of victory. Wherever the sound of the jeep arrived first, the resistance followed with wine, bread, or information. Radios hidden for years came alive again because a vehicle with a working generator had parked outside. The machine became both messenger and message. Progress was possible, freedom mobile, the road itself reclaimable. Then came winter. The snow at first felt like mercy, a clean page over months of mud. But when the cold deepened and the engines thickened, the mercy froze solid. Batteries died, steel grew brittle, oil turned to syrup. Whole columns stalled in silence that smelled of frost and fear. The jeeps refused to stay silent. Crews built fires under the blocks to coax them awake. They drained oil into canteens and slept with it against their chests so it would pour in the morning. When they turned the keys, the little engines coughed, shook, and finally caught 100 tiny resurrections in the blue light of dawn. Every soldier remembers the sound of one specific engine starting after everyone thought it wouldn't. It's the sound of morale measured in RPMs. The Ardennes offensive came with fog so thick it erased the horizon. The Germans struck hard, desperate for one last turn of fortune. The roads disappeared under snow and wreckage. Once again the big machines were trapped, and once again the small ones proved that motion was a kind of defiance. Jeeps carried ammunition along paths that were no more than shadows between trees. They towed sleds of wounded back through forests where the air itself seemed to freeze solid. Drivers wrapped their faces in scarves until only their eyes showed, eyes red from exhaust and sleeplessness. They said little. There wasn't time. But whenever a jeep reached an encircled unit, the cheer that followed was louder than artillery. The Germans listened from the other side of the lines and began to call them mosquitoes. They meant it as contempt. It sounded like prophecy. A mosquito is small, persistent, and carries something that changes the body of the giant it bites. By February 1945, the Allies reached the Rhine. It was broader than anything before, a ribbon of moving steel water that seemed to divide worlds. Bridges lay in ruins. Engineers built pontoons, ferries, anything that could float. And once again, the jeeps were first. Photographs show them with their headlights blacked out, edges sealed with tar, spare tires lashed like buoys. In one frame, a driver grins with water up to his chest. In another, a jeep noses forward as if sniffing for the far bank. None of it should have worked. Enough of it did. When the first American vehicles rolled into Germany proper, they were not heavy tanks crushing the border fences, but jeeps, muddy, dented, still smelling of river water. The laughter that had greeted them 2 years earlier was gone for good. At headquarters, someone counted. More than 500,000 jeeps built since the first prototypes, enough to park end to end from London to Moscow, enough to remind anyone watching that an idea multiplied is stronger than any miracle. They had started as jokes, they ended as proof. And still, even at the edge of victory, they kept doing the same quiet work, hauling bread, letters, stretcher cases, and fuel. Because that was the language they spoke. They were too humble to notice that they had become symbols. When peace finally came, and the long road east became a road home, the jeeps rolled just as they had always done, engines light, steering loose, the horizon always ahead. The men who drove them looked back at the rivers they had crossed and could only shake their heads. They had seen something small behave like something immortal. Part 3. The Machine and the Men. When the Rhine was behind them, Europe opened like a wound finally ready to heal. The front still roared, but the shape of the noise had changed. It was the sound of pursuit now, not survival. The great engines of war pushed east while behind them came an army of smaller sounds, hammers, saws, jeeps. In every ruined village a jeep arrived first. It carried translators who turned fear into sentences, medics who turned silence into breathing, photographers who recorded proof that tomorrow existed. A jeep meant that the line had moved again, that someone had found a road where yesterday there had been none. The machine had outlived its laughter and earned its dignity. It no longer surprised anyone when it crossed a river or a minefield. It simply did what was asked without ceremony. A soldier once wrote in a letter, "If the Jeep could pray, it would ask only for gas and another day." The engineers back home had not designed heroism. They had designed utility. But utility, multiplied by 100,000 acts of courage, had become a kind of grace. The Germans now understood the rhythm of this new army. They could predict the thunder of armor, the drone of bombers, the discipline of supply trains, but not the unpredictable hum of the little vehicles that seemed to ignore geography. A destroyed bridge no longer promised safety. A washed-out road no longer meant delay. The Jeep had taught its drivers to mistrust obstacles. If the way was blocked, there must be another way. If not, make one. This philosophy seeped outward, from mechanics to soldiers to generals. Entire campaigns were drawn around the assumption that movement could not be stopped, only redirected. In war colleges decades later, historians would call it the culture of momentum. But for the men of 1945, it was simpler. If the Jeep could make it, the army could too. As Germany fell back into itself, the land turned strange. Villages without names, factories split open like shells, rivers heavy with the smell of spring and ruin. The roads were a mix of refugees, soldiers, livestock, and dust. The Jeeps threaded through it all. They carried surrender papers, carried orphans to safety, carried journalists who asked how an empire had ended. They carried silence most of all. The drivers didn't talk much. The war had been loud enough. One mechanic later remembered that the hardest thing was not keeping the Jeeps running, but keeping the men from talking to them as if they were alive. "We'd pat the hood like you pat a dog that just came through a storm," he said. "You don't say thank you out loud, but you think it." When the guns finally quieted in May, the Jeeps kept moving. They hauled blankets to camps, ferried doctors to the sick, priests to the dying. They pulled the living from rubble and the dead from memory. The small engine sound became the pulse of rebuilding. In the streets of Paris, children chased them, laughing, while their parents wept. In Warsaw, where the buildings were half sky, the first Allied vehicle to enter was not a tank. It was a Jeep, carrying 3 medics and a box of penicillin. In the Bavarian hills, a pair of Jeeps climbed roads meant for goats to deliver news to isolated farms that the war was over. The same machine that had carried death now carried life, with no sense of irony. Peace was a theory. Logistics was real. The armies had to go home, and the Jeeps went with them. Some were crated, tagged, and shipped back across the Atlantic. Others were left behind, sold, traded, gifted. In every liberated country, someone learned to drive on one. Farmers pulled plows with them, doctors made rounds, postmen delivered letters through mud that had once been battlefields. The Jeep didn't know the difference between war and peace. It only knew work. In one French village, a widow used an abandoned Jeep to start a delivery business. She painted the name of her husband, missing in action, on the hood and refused to repaint it. "He still drives with me," she told anyone who asked. In another, a former German mechanic bought a captured Jeep from an American unit for 2 bottles of wine. He rebuilt it from scraps, taught himself English by translating the stencils on its dashboard, and later used it to start a taxi line. The first passenger was a man he had fought against 2 years earlier. Neither said much during the ride. The world was trying to remember what ordinary felt like, and the Jeep, with its honest noise and small appetite, helped it remember. Back in America, the ports filled again. The ships that had carried fear eastward now carried victory home. On the docks, the Jeeps rolled down gangways one more time, engines coughing, headlights blinking against the new light of peace. Crowds cheered them like old friends returning from a long job. Factories switched from war orders to civilian models. Willys Overland advertised a Jeep for the farm, the city, the world. The same design, almost unchanged. Farmers bought them because they were cheaper than tractors and easier to fix. Hunters bought them because they could climb hills that horses wouldn't. Families bought them because they were curious what it felt like to drive something that had crossed the Rhine. The nation that had built the machine now discovered that it had built a companion. In the Midwest, veterans drove their old Jeeps through parades, flags tied to antennas, kids waving candy wrappers in the air. In small towns, the parades ended, but the Jeeps stayed, pulling floats at fairs, hauling lumber, teaching sons to steer. A reporter in 1946 wrote that America has adopted the Jeep as its new accent, plain, unpretentious, everywhere at once. He wasn't wrong. The vehicle had become a mirror of its people, resilient, a little loud, occasionally reckless, always ready to start again. The surplus Jeeps scattered like seeds. Some ended up in jungles where new wars were already smoldering. Others found their way into mountain villages, desert outposts, Arctic expeditions. Wherever they went, they carried the ghost of the laughter that had once greeted them. For the men who had driven them through the worst of Europe, the sound of that engine would never be just noise again. It was memory dust, rain, exhaustion, relief. They could close their eyes in a garage 20 years later and hear the war start up inside their ribs. Many kept photographs, a Jeep half submerged in mud, a name painted in white letters, friends leaning against it with cigarettes. In those pictures, the machine looks alive, patient, aware of its place in the frame. At reunions, veterans told stories that always began the same way. We were in a Jeep when... The rest hardly mattered. The word itself was shorthand for every mile between terror and survival. Some of the machines outlasted their drivers. You can still find them, rusted but recognizable, in barns and sheds, in museums, on parade grounds. They look small now, almost fragile. But that's the trick of distance. In their time, they were larger than logic. The steel has faded, but the idea remains bright. That a tool built with honesty can earn reverence, that reliability can be a form of heroism. When people speak of the grand inventions of that war, they mention radar, penicillin, the atomic age. Few mention the Jeep. It doesn't mind. It was never built for applause. Its greatest victory was invisibility, the kind that comes from doing the job so well that people forget it was ever in doubt. Years after the war, an old German colonel was interviewed about his memories of fighting Americans. He was asked which of their weapons impressed him most. He thought for a long time, then smiled. "It wasn't a weapon," he said. "It was that little car. We had machines, they had mobility. We built walls, they built roads. The Jeep was a road." History agreed. By the 1950s, the name had escaped the brand. Jeep became a common noun in dozens of languages. In villages across Europe and Asia, children pointed at any small 4x4 and shouted the word. The machine had transcended its origin. It had become an idea, one that belonged to everyone. The armies that had used it moved on to bigger, faster things, but the Jeep remained the memory of a time when courage was measured in miles per hour gallon and steel resolve came on 4 small tires. The laughter that once met it in the desert had turned into something better. Respect. And in that transformation lay the quiet truth of its legend. Part 4. The Legend of Motion. The war ended, yet the world refused to stay still. Engines that had once roared toward battle now idled in the calm of rebuilding. Ships carried men home. Factories went quiet for the first time in years, and on the docks, under the smell of salt and oil, sat the same little vehicles that had outrun tanks, outclimbed mud, and outlived laughter. The Jeeps. They had carried war on their backs. Now they were about to carry peace. Across the United States, the returning soldiers recognized them instantly. The sound of that engine, thin, busy, faithful, was the sound of survival. It stirred something deep, a pulse that said, "Keep moving." When peace felt too large, too silent, They found comfort in motion. Some bought surplus Jeeps from government lots for a few $100s. Others rebuilt the ones that had limped home with bullet holes still patched in tin. The country filled again with that sound, 4 cylinders reminding a restless nation that forward was still the direction of life. On farms, the Jeeps took over where horses had quit. They pulled plows through stubborn clay, dragged logs from winter fields, hauled milk cans to dusty roads. In mountain towns, they became ambulances, school buses, delivery trucks. A single vehicle could serve 10 jobs, and no one was surprised when it did. The veterans who drove them treated the machines with a familiarity normally reserved for dogs. They talked to them, cursed them, praised them, trusted them. The Jeep had never been about comfort. It was about cooperation. Willys Overland saw the future first. In 1946, the company printed an advertisement showing a farmer, a miner, and a young couple beside a freshly painted Jeep. The world's most useful vehicle. The poster read, "No chrome, no promises of luxury, only usefulness." America believed it. The first civilian Jeep, the CJ2i, rolled out of Toledo with almost the same bones that had crossed Europe. Flat hood, upright windshield, iron heart. The war machine became a peace tool without changing its accent. The transformation spread overseas. Through the Marshall Plan and surplus sales, thousands of Jeeps crossed the Atlantic again, this time without guns. They arrived in crates marked for reconstruction, and the people who opened them found hope packed in grease. In France, they hauled stones to rebuild bridges. In Italy, they carried teachers to villages cut off by landslides. In Norway, they pulled sledges through snow. Even in the ruins of Germany, where the laughter had begun, the same shape now carried bread instead of soldiers. To a generation that had lost faith in permanence, the Jeep represented the opposite of fragility. It was proof that something simple could survive catastrophe and come back useful. Children who had never seen an airplane up close learned to say Jeep before they could pronounce liberty. The word spread faster than the product. It entered languages as noun and verb, a symbol of motion itself. The Cold War began before the old one had cooled, and once again the little machine answered the summons. Korea. Frozen ridges. Men wearing the same expressions their fathers had worn in Normandy. The Jeeps returned to war painted darker, with radios bolted behind the seats and heaters that barely worked. They climbed icy switchbacks, carried the wounded down slopes so steep that drivers tied themselves to the wheel. They froze, thawed, and froze again. They started anyway. Veterans called them miracles on 4 wheels. Mechanics called them 50-50 bets. The truth sat between the two. They failed often, but they could be fixed always. When the front shifted, so did the Jeeps, and when peace came again, they rolled back home with snow still trapped in their frames. In the 1950s, the world wanted symbols of adventure more than symbols of victory. The Jeep became both. America built highways, television screens filled with sunshine, and the machine that had once stormed beaches now explored them. Families loaded tents and fishing rods. Fathers told sons, "This thing can go anywhere." And mostly it could. Magazines showed smiling couples perched on tailgates above canyons. The message was quiet but powerful. Freedom wasn't a ceremony, it was a road, and the Jeep could find it. Other automakers chased the idea, but none caught the feeling. The vehicle's shape, honest and squared, resisted fashion. While cars grew fins and polished grins, the Jeep stayed plain, like a handshake that meant something. In Hollywood, directors used it to say, authentic. A soldier returning home drove one. A scientist in the jungle drove one. Explorers, photographers, rebels, all climbed into that same silhouette. It became visual shorthand for courage without swagger. Dust and dignity suited it better than paint ever could. The legend outgrew the brand. Copycats appeared on every continent. Britain built the Land Rover. Russia forged the GAZ. Japan created the Toyota Land Cruiser. Each owed a silent debt to the American blueprint. They imitated its bones, but rarely its spirit. What they couldn't copy was the sense of humor built into the original, its willingness to rattle, to bounce, to look ridiculous and keep going anyway. Historians later wrote that the Jeep democratized geography. It made wild places reachable and ordinary men into explorers. A hunter could drive where only mules had gone. A geologist could map deserts without a caravan. Missionaries, doctors, photographers all used the same humble design to shorten the distance between isolation and civilization. By the early 1960s, the Jeep was no longer a military relic. It was an idea with wheels, the belief that nothing unreachable was truly far, just poorly mapped. The world, however, refused to stay peaceful. Vietnam brought a new kind of war, humid instead of frozen, chaotic instead of linear. Once more the Jeep found itself between soldier and survival. The jungles corroded metal faster than bullets, but the engines kept turning. Drivers wrapped the intakes in rags to keep out water, smeared grease over the distributor caps, and prayed to both God and the carburetor. They called the vehicle Old Faithful again, half joke, half ritual. When helicopters took over the headlines, the Jeeps remained on the ground, connecting bases, delivering mail, carrying the wounded to landing zones. They were the arteries beneath the wings, the reminder that victory still needed wheels. Photographs from that war show young men sitting on hoods, listening to distant artillery, cigarettes glowing like tiny signals. Behind them, the Jeep waits, headlights off. Patient. It has seen this before. Back home, the image of the Jeep changed again. It no longer spoke only of battle or labor. It whispered adventure. Advertisements stopped talking about horsepower and began talking about possibility. Go anywhere, do anything. One slogan read, a sentence that might as well have been carved on its grille. In suburbs, the machine looked strange, too rugged for driveways, but people bought it anyway. They wanted its attitude, not its utility. It reminded them of courage in an age of convenience. Owning one meant you believed that roads were suggestions, not orders. And so the Jeep passed quietly from necessity to nostalgia, from military asset to cultural artifact. But its legend remained busy, never idle. It turned into film stars, toy models, and metaphors. Writers used it to describe resilience. Politicians used it to describe simplicity. Somewhere in all that talk, the real thing kept doing what it had always done, starting on cold mornings, shaking a little, and finding traction where logic said none existed. Half a century after that first laugh in the desert, a reunion was held in Ohio for surviving veterans and surviving Jeeps. They parked 50 of them in a long line across a field. Different colors, same soul. Men in their 70s ran their hands over hoods, recognizing dents like old scars. Engines started one by one, coughing into chorus. For a moment the years dissolved, and the sound of that chorus carried across the grass like a reminder of everything ordinary that had once saved the extraordinary. One reporter asked a veteran what he thought when he looked at the line of machines. The man shrugged. "They just did what we asked," he said. "That's all any of us ever tried to do." And that, perhaps, was the secret. Obedient purpose turned into quiet immortality. By the end of the century, the Jeep had become both relic and prophecy. New versions rolled off lines with digital dials and sleek edges, but under the surface the spirit stayed unaltered. The world had changed its landscapes, some paved, some political, but the idea of going forward without permission still felt right. The laughter of the old enemies was long gone, replaced by something deeper: admiration. The machine that once looked like a toy had outlived empires. It had proven that simplicity is the most sophisticated form of strength. And somewhere, in a barn or a museum, A small olive-drab shape still waits, tires half flat, engine quiet, perfectly ready for one more start. Part 5. The Road That Never Ends. The century moved on, but the shape remained. By the 1970s, the world had changed so much that people could watch wars on television instead of fighting them, could fly over deserts that once took weeks to cross. Yet when they needed to touch the earth again, to reach where the map stopped, they reached for the same machine. It no longer belonged to any single army. The Jeep had been absorbed into the bloodstream of the planet. Every continent had its version. Square hood, short wheelbase, the promise that if there was ground beneath you, you could go forward. In jungles, missionaries painted crosses on the doors. In savannas, rangers welded cages to keep lions out. In mountain towns, doctors strapped oxygen tanks in the back. A single design had adapted to 100 languages of necessity. The roar of empire had faded, replaced by the hum of aid convoys and exploration teams. And always, under the noise, that same rhythm, an engine working harder than it should, yet never asking for thanks. When the oil crises of the 1970s came, Americans rediscovered humility in motion. Gasoline lines snaked through cities. Big cars died waiting for their turn. The Jeep, small and stubborn, kept running. It didn't care about shortages. It had been born in them. Mechanics laughed that it could run on fumes and coffee grounds if it had to. Farmers who had never given up their wartime models drove past stalled sedans with quiet satisfaction. Magazines began calling it America's conscience on wheels. It was a compliment wrapped in irony, the reminder that endurance mattered more than extravagance. When a machine built for chaos survives peace better than those built for comfort. You learn something about both. The same decade brought adventure television, grainy footage of men in dusty hats driving jeeps through rivers, jungles, volcanoes. The narration was always the same: man versus nature. What they didn't say was that the real hero was often the vehicle that got man there in the first place. It became the face of endurance, not fast, not flawless, but unstoppable. Expedition teams to the Himalayas used them until the air grew too thin for combustion. Scientists drove them onto glaciers. Filmmakers chased storms with them. The Jeep had found its new front line, the frontier of curiosity. In 1980, a photographer named John Norton took a picture in Ethiopia. A small convoy of humanitarian jeeps wound across a plain the color of rust. In the distance, a line of women carried water jugs on their heads. The photo appeared on magazine covers around the world. People saw drought, despair, and behind it, those familiar shapes moving toward the horizon. The vehicles had no flags, no slogans. Their sides were painted with the blue letters of the United Nations. Yet everyone who looked recognized them instantly. They were the same descendants of the machines that had once crossed the Rhine. The caption read, "Still crossing." In that one image, the Jeep's legend shed its last trace of war. It had become a messenger of mercy. Doctors Without Borders, the Red Cross, UNICEF, every organization that reached into disaster zones trusted the same DNA of design: light, repairable, fearless. A Jeep in a convoy meant help was coming, even when the road had disappeared. Meanwhile, back in the wealthy world, the legend grew slicker. Automakers turned the name into a badge for comfort. SUVs appeared, gleaming and proud, whispering luxury more than grit. They wore the word Jeep like a medal, though many of them had never touched real mud. Yet even inside all that polish, the ghost of the original lived on. The shape still hinted at utility. The stance still promised courage. Commercials showed polished models climbing mountains just wet enough to look heroic. Voiceovers spoke of freedom and authenticity. Most of the viewers knew it was fantasy, but they liked being reminded of what was once real. In driveways across suburbia, the warhorse had become a house pet. Still, Every now and then, someone would steer it off-road, hear the gravel under the tires, and understand for a moment why their grandfather had loved the sound. In 1991, when the Gulf War erupted, the little machine was there again, evolved, armored, renamed. The modern Humvee was larger, faster, hungrier, but its ancestry was obvious. Soldiers called it the Jeep's grandson, heavier, louder, but with the same defiant heart. On desert highways under black smoke, the lineage rolled forward, proof that simplicity, once perfected, never truly dies, only scales. Yet even as the military modernized, the old Jeeps survived in corners of the earth where improvisation still ruled. In South America, farmers turned them into buses by welding benches into the beds. In India, they became taxis painted every color of hope. In Africa, they carried film crews into wildlife reserves, their paint faded to the color of dust. In the Balkans, they ferried refugees through minefields, engines whispering prayers stronger than armor. Everywhere, the message was the same. Movement is a form of faith. By the dawn of the new millennium, the Jeep had entered mythology. There were museums for it, clubs devoted to its restoration, songs written about it. There were annual gatherings where hundreds of restored models drove together in long lines, engines harmonizing like an orchestra of survivors. The men and women behind the wheels were no longer soldiers, but enthusiasts, engineers, teachers, artists. They didn't share battles. They shared admiration for the idea that reliability could be beautiful. At one such event, a veteran leaned over a polished hood and said to a teenager restoring his first Jeep, "Kid, that thing carried freedom on its back." The boy nodded as if hearing scripture. In that moment, the machine had become more than history. It had become heritage. Modern engineers, working on electric drive trains and self-driving software, still study the old blueprints. The original Jeep remains a lesson in restraint. Use only what you need, design for repair, not replacement. It stands as a quiet rebuke to complexity. The 21st century likes to imagine progress as speed, but the Jeep whispers another truth, that progress is persistence. In disaster zones struck by earthquakes and floods, its modern descendants still lead the way. The markings change, sometimes military, sometimes humanitarian, but the silhouette is eternal. It announces itself not with roar, but with reliability. When the 2010 Haiti earthquake cut the roads to Port-au-Prince, the first vehicles to reach the city center were a fleet of old Jeeps, engines rebuilt a dozen times. When typhoons hit the Philippines, they were there again, roofs piled with supplies. Even in 2020, when global lockdowns emptied streets, some aid workers crossed checkpoints in converted Jeeps, carrying oxygen tanks and food. The vehicle that had survived the 1940s kept finding new wars worth fighting. Wars against time, distance, and despair. What makes it immortal isn't steel, it's what it teaches. The Jeep was never the fastest, strongest, or prettiest. It was the most forgiving. It accepted imperfection and made usefulness out of it. That is why it outlasted arrogance and fashion alike. If you stand near one long enough, you start to understand the sound. A heartbeat in metal, steady and unconcerned. It doesn't demand to be admired. It asks only to be driven. And when you drive it, you join an unbroken conversation between generations that refused to stop at the edge of the map. In every war zone, every rescue mission, every quiet Sunday trail, the Jeep speaks the same language. We can make it. Sometimes that's enough to change the world. Today, in the age of satellites and touch screens, the machine still feels ancient and necessary. People climb into restored models not to go somewhere, but to remember what motion used to mean. They grip the thin steering wheel, smell the faint oil and canvas, hear the rattle that sounds like history laughing gently at comfort. They start the engine, and for a few seconds, the past and present share the same breath. The road may have changed, but the reason for driving has not. The Jeep endures because humanity still hungers for the feeling it gave soldiers in mud, farmers in rain, and explorers at the edge of the world. The feeling that limits can be crossed if you're stubborn enough, and that, perhaps, is the truest definition of freedom. Part 6. The laugh that never came back. The laughter that once echoed across the deserts of North Africa never returned. It dissolved somewhere between the last river crossed and the first road rebuilt. The men who laughed were gone. The war that birthed the sound was gone. But the little machine that caused it, square, stubborn, impossible, refused to fade. It kept moving, and because of that, its echo still moves with us. When people speak of the great inventions that shaped the 20th century, they mention the airplane, the computer, the bomb. They rarely mention the Jeep. But history is not always written by what flies highest or burns brightest. Sometimes it's written by what refuses to stop. The Jeep was never a monument. It was motion given form, a collection of bolts and metal that somehow learned endurance better than the men who built it. It became, without meaning to, the mechanical equivalent of perseverance. In the decades after the guns went quiet, the Jeeps that survived began new lives. Some were sold for scrap, some rusted away in barns, others became workhorses on farms. A few ended up in museums, gleaming behind ropes, polished by time and reverence. Yet the true memorials were the ones still running, the ones that still smelled of dust and gasoline, the ones that started on the third pull like they always had. To climb into one of those old seats is to feel history breathing through the steering column. You grip the wheel and realize it's been held by hundreds of hands. Soldiers, farmers, explorers, aid workers. The texture of the leather tells its own story. Fear, fatigue, hope, endurance. The metal beneath your feet vibrates with the same defiance that once carried men across continents. There are faster machines, stronger machines, smarter ones, but none so honest. Every country kept its version. In Poland, in India, in Kenya, in Chile, you can still find one tucked behind a workshop or parked by a dirt road. Some carry crates of oranges, some barrels of water, some the laughter of children. The engines sputter, cough, and find rhythm again, as if embarrassed to be doubted. Their persistence is no miracle. It's habit. In one Cambodian village, an aid convoy broke down miles from the main road. Only the oldest vehicle kept moving, a 1944 Willys, engine rebuilt by hand. It carried doctors and vaccines through monsoon mud that swallowed everything else. When they finally reached the village, the locals gathered around, touching the hood, smiling as if meeting an old friend. They didn't know what to call it. They just said, "It came." That phrase is the essence of its legend. It came. When others failed, it arrived. In Normandy, where the story first grew wings, the beaches still whisper that sound. Every June, restored Jeeps roll along the same sand where fear once stood. Their engines are softer now, more ceremonial than desperate. But the vibration carries memory. Veterans in their 90s sit in the passenger seats, hands trembling, eyes bright. The young drivers watch them quietly, aware they're steering more than a vehicle. They're steering continuity. One of the veterans, asked what he thought hearing that engine again, smiled through tears. "It sounds," he said, "like we made it." And that, perhaps, is the entire point. The machine never asked for reverence, but it earned it through reliability. It asked for oil, for fuel, for a little patience. It gave back faith. The Jeep didn't change the war. It changed the way men survived it. It gave motion to belief. It turned uncertainty into momentum. Even the engineers who designed it didn't understand what they'd made. They built it to function, not to symbolize. Yet symbols have a way of sneaking into usefulness. Somewhere between the first bolt tightened in Toledo and the last bridge crossed in Europe, The Jeep transformed from a vehicle into a mirror of its makers, imperfect, noisy, adaptable, unbreakable in spirit. The nations that once fought over ideology now collect and restore these old machines together. At international meets you can see American flags, German flags, French, British, Russian, all lined up in peace, engines idling in friendly rhythm. The sound that once meant invasion now means reunion. History found balance in its own echo. And yet, beyond nostalgia, the Jeep continues to serve. In Africa they carry medicine, in the Andes they carry teachers, in flooded plains of Bangladesh they carry food. In war zones, journalists ride in them because nothing else survives the roads. Decade after decade, they appear wherever people refuse to surrender to terrain or despair. They are still quietly doing their job. In Haiti, after the 2010 earthquake, a journalist wrote that the first real sound of hope wasn't a helicopter overhead, but a small 4-cylinder engine on the road below. It sounded, he wrote, like civilization coming back. That sentence could describe half the 20th century. There's a strange comfort in that simplicity. When technology grows complex enough to confuse even its creators, the Jeep stands as reminder. Function is meaning. It's a philosophy made of grease and grit. You don't ask if it will work. You help it work. It invites you to participate in your own success. That may be why people still fall in love with it, not because it's glamorous, but because it's earnest. It doesn't pretend. It tells the truth about how progress happens. Slowly, noisily, with a few leaks, but forward all the same. The world spins faster now, satellites above, algorithms below, but somewhere on a mountain trail, someone still turns an old key, hears that uneven heartbeat, and smiles. The future hums in silence, the past still rattles proudly. There's a story told among restorers. A farmer once left his Jeep outside for 40 years. When his grandson found it, the tires were gone, the frame half sunk in earth, the seats turned to dust. He spent months restoring it, bolt by bolt. The first time the engine started, he burst into tears. Later he said, "It felt like waking up my grandfather." That's the magic of endurance. It collapses time. The sound of that engine is the same sound heard in Tunisia, in Normandy, in the Ardennes, in Korea, in Vietnam. Across generations, across reasons, it remains the same promise. You're not done yet. History has a way of erasing what it owes. The Jeep resists erasure because it was never built to impress. It was built to arrive. Its dignity comes from repetition, not rarity. It has crossed deserts, mountains, jungles, and decades, proving a simple truth. What moves with purpose can never truly die. And so even now, somewhere in the dark of a barn or the glow of a museum light, one still waits. Oil thick with age, tires soft, but ready, waiting for a hand on the key, for the spark that says, "Try again." Because that's what it was always trying to teach. That motion is faith made mechanical. The laughter that once mocked it turned into admiration, and admiration into silence. That silence is its monument. It doesn't need marble or speeches, just the next road, and someone brave enough to take it. When the engine turns over for the last time, long after the last veteran has gone, the echo will stay, a faint hum in the wind, somewhere between memory and promise, whispering the only prayer it ever knew: keep moving, always forward, never stop.